Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Mike Balsamo. I'm the National Law Enforcement Editor at the Associated Press. We're so glad to have you with us today, whether you're an AP reader, a donor who supports our work, or you simply heard about this event and you wanted to tune in. You help make this work possible, and we're so grateful. This week, the Associated Press is hosting its very first Press Freedom Week. Over the next 5 days, we'll explore how journalists secure access to the world's biggest stories, what it takes to investigate powerful institutions, and how we protect our mental health amid relentless breaking news. Today, we'll start with the big picture, why press freedom matters and what's at stake when that principle is threatened. I'm joined today by three leaders in journalism and press freedom advocacy. First, Julie Pace, the executive editor of the Associated Press. Joining us as well is Terry Tang, executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, and Jody Ginsburg is CEO of the Committee to Protect Journalists. AP is an independent, not-for-profit news organization with no corporate owner, no shareholders, and no paywall. If you've relied on AP reporting to understand the world, please consider making a gift at apnews.com/donate or by scanning the QR code on the screen. Every contribution makes a real difference. Just one last thing before we get started. The views expressed during Press Freedom Week events are those of the speakers and not necessarily the Associated Press. This nonpartisan program is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. And with that, we'll jump into it. So I'll start with a question to all of our panelists here, Julie, Terry, Jody. If you had to describe the state of press freedom right now in a sentence or two, what would you say?
Thanks, Mike. Sure. And thank you so much for everybody for joining us. We are really excited that there's so much interest in press freedom and in supporting the work that all of our organizations do. And I think that's in particular because, to answer your question, Mike, I would say that press freedom is under threat, and it's under threat around the world. You know, we work in about 100 countries at the AP, and people often ask me to list the countries where I am most concerned about press freedom. And one of the things that has been so stark over the last couple of years is that when I try to give a concise list, it's actually becoming quite hard. That list just keeps growing. And so, you know, we are constantly almost having to play this game of whack-a-mole right now and trying to figure out, you know, where we can focus our resources, where we focus most attention, and where we can try to make the progress, because I don't think this is a lost cause. That's why we all are so passionate about this, because we do think that we can turn the tide if we can help make people understand why press freedom is not about us as news organizations. It's really about the public, and it's about the public's ability to get information.
I can jump in if you want, Mike. You know, look, I think in one word, dismal. We've been doing this work at the Committee to Protect Journalists for 40 years. This is the most dangerous time since we started the work to be a journalist. And what's striking about this moment, as Julie mentioned, is it's not just the traditional places. I think we have tended to think that authoritarian regimes and war are those places in which journalists are in danger, and everywhere else they're able to report freely and safely. And that's just simply not the case anymore. Pretty much everywhere in the world, we see journalists under threat. We see them harassed online, demonized by those in positions of power. We see increasing numbers of journalists, record numbers of journalists over the past 3 years, jailed for their work, persecuted for their work, and of course, killed. Last year was the deadliest on record for journalists. And I know we're going to talk about that in a little while. So the situation is dire. This is a four-alarm situation. And I think it's really important that we're having this week, because I think as a profession, we've tended to think we don't really like to talk about ourselves. It's somehow self-indulgent. We know from our work that when democracies decline, the first people under attack are journalists. So this doesn't just matter for journalists and journalism. It matters for all of us and all of our freedoms, because those attacks are always precursors to restrictions on other freedoms.
Terry, do you want to add anything there?
Yes. Thank you everyone for being here, and Julie and Jody, and you operate in international realms, and the LA Times does too, but not nearly as much as what you all do and see. So I certainly, very much appreciate that. In the US, certainly, for the LA Times and American news organizations, the threat is not quite the same, but it is, certainly on social media, the threats and attacks towards journalists for what they report. is accelerating. And so we are dealing with that. Our journalists have, it's not a new thing to get challenges to our reporting, and then some level of threat to our journalists. But we see that becoming more of an issue. And then in other ways, defining what a journalist does in protest situations, who are journalists, how law enforcement responds to journalists, that has accelerated and become a real significant problem. And so whether you put out your press tag and say, I am press, and you're still shot and you're still injured, that is a significant thing that we had not seen years ago. And so those are threats that we see on a very regular basis.
And we'll talk more about most of those threats here in just a minute. But Julie, let me come over to you for this. So we're seeing increasing signs of restricted access for independent, fact-based news organizations, whether that's the elimination of the wire pool at the White House, the closure of the correspondence corridor at the Pentagon, or elsewhere in the U.S., as Terry was just mentioning. How should we understand this moment? Is this do you see this as episodic friction, or do you think there's something more systemic here?
Look, I certainly think that it's hard to argue that it's not systemic, because we are seeing it play out in so many different ways. I do think there's a copycat effect that happens when you see something happening at a federal level and then carrying into state levels in the US. But look, when you ask about why this is happening, and I think in some ways the answer is fairly simple. If you are an independent, if you're a fact-based news organization, your job is to show up every day and to try to inform the public, and to not advance an agenda, to not try to promote one political party or one set of interests, is to report the facts. And that makes many people in power nervous. They would much rather have news organizations there that are there to validate what they do, that are going to avoid asking hard questions. And so you do see this systematic effort to try to take people out of that situation, to try to literally limit their ability to hold powerful interests to account. Now, you see lots of situations, particularly in the past, where you had powerful figures who were willing to take that on. And I think that happened in both political parties. People saw it as a strength to be able to be challenged by journalists, to be able to have their policies and their agendas, withhold that kind of scrutiny, because ultimately they felt like they were responsible to the people that elected them in the first place. And that is very much how we see our job. We don't see it as being antagonistic. We don't see it as being oppositional, but we are there to hold governments in particular to account, because they are the representatives of the public. And so I do think there is this systematic effort to take those types of news organizations quite literally out of the room or out of the building.
And this weekend's attack of the White House Correspondents' Dinner really underscored that threats, can be physical as well as institutional. How's that changing how you're thinking about the risk environment that your journalists are operating in, and what news leaders need to do now in order to protect their people?
Sure. And Jody and I were both there in Washington this weekend with members of our team. And, I think we could all say that we're quite grateful that situation wasn't worse. But I do think that, one of the things that it shows is that, the threats are so multifaceted, and, the press is, sometimes directly targeted. The press can be collateral in situations, and it means that we're having to just constantly be on guard, which can sound very scary. But there are also ways we can be prepared. And that's a lot about what we talk about. How can we make sure that we are prepared? The one thing I would say, and Jody may want to add to this, the thing that was really remarkable after those very kind of scary couple of minutes there is a room full of journalists performing journalism. That's what everybody instantly did. Terry had journalists in the room who were doing the same thing. And that was everyone's first reaction, is to report, to focus on the facts, to not speculate about it. And that actually was quite inspiring after those initial scary moments.
Jody, do you want to add anything in there before?
Yeah, I think it was quite, just to echo that, it was quite remarkable. I happened to be at a table that was behind the C-SPAN videographer, the C-SPAN journalist, who just kept filming. Everybody was shouting, "Get down, get down." As a non-American, I think I probably had a slightly less immediate reaction than perhaps some of my colleagues. So I, in typical kind of journalist fashion, sort of kept popping my head up um, to try and work out what was going on. But I was by no means the only person, right? And many people really immediately trying to make sense of this, to document this, so that not for glory, but so that people could understand what was happening. This is a historic moment. Very, very relieved that it wasn't, as Judy said, a much worse situation. But I think it is indicative of the kinds of dangers that journalists face. In some cases, of course, we're seeing journalists be deliberately targeted for being press, and in some cases, obviously, they're in danger because they are trying to film increasingly dangerous situations. If you think about what happened, for example, in Minnesota at the beginning of the year, journalists many of whom were not necessarily people who had a great deal of experience covering wars, although unfortunately, journalists in Minnesota and Minneapolis have had previous experience of having to cover violent protests, but having to rush into those situations, work out how to keep themselves safe, work out how to find the right kinds of equipment. And that's something we're seeing more and more in places across the world, is that the kinds of trainings, the kinds of preparations that you might traditionally have made, or news organizations would traditionally, hopefully, have provided to journalists going into war zones and volatile situations, we're having to develop new ways of teaching that to people who are going to cover rallies and protests here in the United States and elsewhere in order to keep themselves safe. And it's not hyperbole. The kinds of violence that journalists are experiencing is happening every day. There were journalists tackled to the ground during those protests, arrested, had tear gas sprayed in their faces. So that means that everybody is now having to make very different calculations about covering those. And of course, that's been complicated in the United States by people also having to think about their immigration status. If you are covering, particularly if you are covering immigration-related protests and events, people are increasingly worried about their own status in the United States. And that's one of the things that we've been getting more and more queries about over the past year.
Judy, I want to stick with you a little bit to come back to some of the points that Julie was making earlier about, pressures that we're seeing in the U.S. on press freedom. So, from a global perspective, how do you see this moment? How do you see it comparing to, what you're seeing elsewhere around the world and what you have been seeing around the world? And is that a convergence of a global trend, or do you think the U.S. is diverging from what we've seen in other countries?
I don't think the US is diverging. I think what's happening in the US is exactly what we've seen in many other deteriorating democracies worldwide, which is a mixture of public denigration of the press by those in positions of power. So Donald Trump calling journalists enemies of the press, and that has filtered all the way down, right down to local level. We see online harassment of journalists. We see legal threats against journalists, including from the very top. So, of course, the kinds of legal threats we've seen against CBS, Wall Street Journal, and others. And then, of course, regulatory pressures, politicized regulatory pressures, which you've seen here. The difference is that it is happening here at warp speed. So when you look at somewhere like the Philippines, or you look at somewhere like Hungary, that took many years to play out. Here it has happened in less than 12 months. And I think that's the difference. And of course, I think one of the things that's hard to grasp, I think, for a lot of journalists, if you've traditionally worked in an environment of relative freedom where you can speak freely, it's very difficult to come to terms with the fact that this is a very different environment. So there continues to be a kind of it can't happen hereism, when it is happening here. It is absolutely happening here. And so that, I think, is a major challenge. It's not that it's different, it's that it's happening at high speed, and it's very difficult, particularly when you've got so many multi-pronged attacks, right? All at the same time. I think Julie used the term whack-a-mole. Like it's so hard to know where to prioritize. Are we working on physical safety? Are we working on legal protections? Are we working on regulatory challenges? Particularly if you are a small local newsroom, right? So, we are on the call, you have two relatively large organizations, but if you are a small local news outlet, you won't have all of that kind of resource that, say, an AP would have. And that's where we're trying to really step in, and many other organizations as well alongside us, to try and support those organizations in particular.
let me throw this one to all of you, and Terry, maybe you can start here. Not all pressure on journalism is public or obvious, but what are the pressures that you're worrying about right now that the public might not fully see? What are you most worried about that's not as obvious to people?
Well, there are many, but I did want to get back to that conversation right now, that the threat on journalism from kind of the public sector and leaders in power, I think it is hard to comprehend kind of the closing of the window, where it felt very, very, I mean, the idea that a journalistic organization would be sued by the leaders, political leaders, and then have kind of the pincer move with regulatory decisions being made or threats made against a journalistic enterprise. That is not something I really have seen in my career. And so for that to happen, it's very hard for journalistic organizations to begin to grapple with that, to understand what that means, and to, have to pay the consequences of defending the institution, whether it's a lawsuit that essentially, it goes through the process, extremely, extremely costly. So those are things that are being dealt with now by big newsrooms, maybe smaller newsrooms, but the smaller newsrooms won't be able to sustain that kind of defense. So I don't think American journalists could have foreseen that you have to be on the defense for something like that. And so we're trying to understand all of that. And even if your newsroom has not been subjected to that particular kind of press freedom challenge, you are aware of it. And that kind of changes the ballgame a bit. But other threats and sort of challenges are, of course, financial, in many ways. Kind of this, as we've long said for now 15, 20 years, the secular change in journalistic enterprises being commercial enterprises needing. I mean, we're not nonprofit. American journalism has generally been a commercial enterprise. It is, it's based on people, the advertising, sponsorship, subscriptions. So those things have come under tremendous challenge because of technological change and how we deliver our journalism. It's funny because our ambitions are no smaller. Our principles are the same. Delivering facts, and that is hard. I mean, just this weekend we had, I don't know, almost, dozens of reporters and editors really working on the suspect in the, White House Correspondent Association dinner. That just it doesn't just fall out of the sky. These are professional journalists, many of them with decades of experience, being able to figure out how to find that information, how to confirm that information. Even our principles of having two sources to confirm the name of the suspect. Those things have not changed, but the economics of the industry have changed entirely, so that the people producing the content, the journalism, are at the back end of, kind of the revenues in many ways. So our work is not, so that is a challenge that the industry is working through. And so that's a very difficult thing. And for people, and this term has long been used now, it seems like for a long time, about news deserts, smaller communities that have had their newspapers closed. That is like a real challenge to press, to freedom, the freedom to know, the freedom to monitor. Without professional journalists, there's nobody to do that. How would you know what is happening in your city council unless you physically go to city council meetings? You try to figure out whether, the budget is square, like what happened. And But that was the job of American journalism. And so that's a very concerning thing to me. And, as a, large newsroom, we're working on that all the time and trying to serve our community. But it doesn't come without a lot of cost. And we just hope that our community sees the value that we continue to deliver. Certainly they did this weekend in a bad situation, but we were able to give people the information they wanted.
And maybe to pick up on that, and Mike, because I think this connects to your question of like, what are the pressures and some of the forces that are kind of maybe unseen happening in the background? I do think that a lot of what concerns me is that, this crackdown on press freedom is, as Terry said, happening against, the backdrop of a very challenging economic environment and a lot of changes in technology and the ways in which people are getting news. And so I think one of the things that, we worry about and we're always on guard for is just that notion of journalist burnout or journalists saying, this is too much, right? The crackdown on press freedom, the fact that you're being attacked on social media, the fact that you're facing physical threats, the fact that that may extend to your family and your loved ones, that the pressure becomes too much. It's why, again, we're so grateful to have so many people who were interested in showing up today to support this issue, because I think that, we know how important and vital this work is, but I think we do have to do a better job as an industry of telling our own story so that we can really also encourage journalists to stay in the game, to stay in this, because it is so vital to democracy in the United States and really around the world. And so that is one of the things, that I think is a hidden consequence potentially of the crackdown on press freedom.
I would add to that, that the public, what the public does not know, it doesn't even know what it's missing. That is the problem, right? When you see a grocery store and the shelves are empty, you can see that it's empty. But what you can't see the diminishment of journalism, because then you wouldn't know what you have, the investigations that we produce. Those are things the public did not know prior to our publishing it, prior to our spending months, and same with the AP. Every journalistic enterprise, the public wouldn't know what it should know, and it's only because we have proactively sought out a problem, seen the seed of a problem, and then followed it. So that's the other thing about we talk about content and we talk about journalism. It's not equivalent to just any other commercial product where there was a product and now it's gone. So I think that's the other thing that the public, it takes a long time for that to dawn on the public and for the public to understand and to realize what is happening.
Can I just add one thing? I know Mike probably wants to jump in, but I think that's why some of the decisions around, for example, cutting funding to public media have been so key, because it's part of press freedom is having a pluralistic media. And that means that you need a wide variety of organizations that are going to be able to report on hyperlocal things, to big news organizations that are able to bring that bigger picture together. And once you start to gut some of that funding, because there's not always a commercial model that's going to come in and replace it, people start to not have the information that you need. If you think about somewhere like Public Radio in Alaska, they do a really, really important job reporting, doing tsunami watch, reporting on environmental challenges that the local community need. And if you've got the funding to that, there is nothing else to replace it. And so that's why both those decisions to gut locally and independently and publicly funded media have been such a problem. But it's also why we've been so concerned about media consolidation in the US and what's happening with the regulator. And just to give you an example, back in, I think, 1983, 90% of American media companies were owned by 50 companies. Today, almost all the media is controlled by just 6 corporations. And so the continued consolidation presents a risk that people have less and less access to a wide variety of different media, which is essential for press freedom and people's ability to be properly informed.
I want to follow up there and just zoom out a little bit for a second. So, you've all seen different eras of this, right? Different eras of the pressures on journalism, but what feels genuinely different about this moment? I'm curious about what you're seeing now that you haven't seen before. Julie, you obviously were White House correspondent, you were Washington bureau chief. What's different now?
Look, I think actually one of the biggest differences, there are a lot of differences, but the biggest one I would call out is that, the public does have so many other alternatives in terms of information, right? So I think that wasn't always the case. If you go way back, you had maybe your local newspaper, you had some local television stations and a few nationals, right? So there was a sort of flow of information that was actually quite controlled. And obviously we've seen that grow and change. And to Jody's point, I think in so many ways, that's a real positive, right? That there are more places for people to get information. Information is more accessible. The downside is that so much of that information is not credible. And so when you're seeing independent kind of fact-based reporting being restricted, it doesn't mean that people don't get any information. It just means that a lot of the information that they may be getting, or a lot of the information that may be getting pushed to them through algorithms and sort of social media and technology companies, is either inaccurate and doesn't have full information, is more opinion than actual reporting, or is really kind of confirming what they already believe. I think we have all had this experience when you start to go down a little bit of an online rabbit hole. Suddenly everything that's being pushed to you is kind of about that same topic or kind of pushed in that same vein. And that really limits the ability for the public to understand a different perspective, to see different facts that are out there. So I think that's the big difference. Again, that this external environment is really, I think, giving people an option. And so if the public, if the independent press is being criticized, if people believe that we're not, that we don't have the value that we all know that we carry, or we're being restricted, there's other information, I believe, of a lower quality that will fill that space.
Terry, Jody, what do you think?
Well, I'm gonna zoom out a little bit and talk about not just the United States. I mean, one of the fundamental shifts that we've seen obviously in the last 2.5 years is obviously the record numbers of journalists killed worldwide. The vast majority of those are Palestinian journalists killed by Israel and Gaza. And I think we cannot have a conversation about press freedom and the current situation unless we acknowledge that. Our colleagues in Gaza have been killed in unprecedented numbers. And one of the challenges that we face is that the complete impunity that Israel and many other countries enjoy in terms of their attacks on journalists. And so one of the things that I think is different potentially to years gone by is a lack of willingness amongst countries and states who would traditionally be defenders of press freedom and very vocal in press freedom, and indeed have been in issues such as Afghanistan and Ukraine, who have been utterly silent on Gaza in particular. And I know obviously the AP has had journalists killed by Israel and Gaza, and I think that we can't underestimate the impact that that has had globally, because it's not just impunity that sits in one place. Impunity spreads. Once people see that they can get away with killing journalists and there'll be no repercussions, that they can get away with jailing journalists and there'll be no repercussions, they continue to do it over and over again. And so it's, one of the things that we're pushing very hard is to try to get governments to hold not just their enemies, but their allies to account when they violate press freedom, when they violate international humanitarian law. And that's a major, major shift that I think we've seen. And I also think we can't underestimate what the impact that a failure to stand up very vocally amongst the journalistic community for Gazan journalists has had on journalists in the region and many others who feel and have felt, frankly, abandoned by their community. So definitely as journalists, we have got to get better, not just at defending the profession and explaining the value of the information. Both Julie and Terry have talked extensively about the value that journalism has and why we need to do a better job explaining that to people. But I think we need to do not just a better job of explaining the value of journalism in the same way that we, doctors might talk about the value of a healthy lifestyle and therefore the importance of having informed, trained doctors to support you. But we also need to stand up for our colleagues within the profession very vocally and very loudly. And I think we've failed to do that in the past 2.5 years. And if we want this profession to remain one that is safe and is supported, then we need to also stand up for our colleagues who are under attack.
Yeah, I completely agree with Julie and Jody. What Julie was saying about kind of the information universe becoming a very different kind of place now. I think that is something that is in some ways somewhat different in the last 10 years or so, where that information, where people cannot really tell the difference when they are getting information, on social platforms that is not true, that is conspiratorial, that is, and worse, many of those voices, millions of those voices, are attacking the press, the professional press that lives by, principles, and that we do our very best to get, actual facts, to confirm facts. So when fake news becomes kind of the attack against professional journalists, people who are trying to live by the principles that we are trying to live by, that makes it a very significant challenge to penetrate. So you end up having, what worries me, I think, is the schism and the enormous polarization of understanding what is real and what is a fact. And that affects way more than press freedom. It affects, how democracy works. And so I think, so it's kind of all part of the same, phenomenon. And that's very concerning to me. I don't think we had that maybe 20 years ago. I mean, even though there wasn't the kind of social platforms, it is that effect and phenomenon that I think will take a long time to change. And so we have to work very hard at it to build trust in professional journalists. And I think we build trust by, proving ourselves every day, to our subscribers and to our audience that, we're, as I like to say, we're the only business that runs corrections every day. We try to own up to our mistakes. Nobody does that for fun. Nobody does that to think, oh, well, I'll get some, I'll get a merit badge from my customers. But we do that because we think it's the right thing to do, and it's part of the tradition of journalism. And I don't see that happening, in the universe of bots or the universe of people who are not professional journalists. They don't have a daily correction series. Everything that we did wrong, or editor's notes, or trying to make it, when people write to us, we try to make it right. We further, hunt down what we did wrong, and we talk to, and then we correct. That isn't happening elsewhere. That's part of our, kind of our legacy. That's part of our, professionalism. And so I think that living by those standards gets harder when everybody around you, or the greater universe of information dissemination, is not living by that.
Jerry, I'm going to stick with you for this one, and then Julie and Jody, I'd love for you to jump in here too. When we're talking about these risks to journalism and journalists, whether that's, legal pressure, physical safety, online harassment, what does that actually look like in your newsroom to protect reporters in that moment? What are you actually doing now? What do those conversations look like? And just talk to us a little bit tactically about, what's happening and what's changed in particular over the last few years.
Well, I'll go. We have been inundated with news. So we just, get our heads down and we are just working. We are calling people, we are door knocking, we're getting documents, we are seeking, we are, filing FOIAs. So in some ways, the professional, the journalist, the newsroom is just doing what it knows best. But we're also aware of all these other factors and forces that we just talked about. I mean, I think there's no professional journalist who isn't aware of that, but a lot of it is Well, in spite of that, we're going to go forward. You know, in spite of that, we're going to keep our newsroom optimistic about our press freedoms and optimistic that our work makes a real difference. And we have seen that it does make a difference. It serves our, you know, it serves our community. And when we go out into the community, we are, I think we continue to maintain kind of our reputation because we are doing the work we should be doing. So, you know, journalists have to be skeptical but optimistic. And I think we're always trying to, you know, kind of maintain that balance.
Skeptical and optimistic is a good combination. You know, I can add a little color when it comes to sort of what we're doing to keep our journalists safe. And Mike, you've been at the center of a lot of this. You know, we, as I said, we're a global organization, so this looks very different depending on where you are in the world. You know, the first thing that we have done is we have made some real investments, both in our global security team. That means bringing on to staff more people in, you know, in-house security advisor roles. They run trainings around the world, and that is everything from, you know, how to safely cover a demonstration that's happening to how to be on the front lines in an active combat zone to how to cover a wildfire. You know, the range of threats that people face are enormous. We have had to layer into that certainly trainings around online safety, trainings around legal protections for journalists in different parts of the world, you know, what to know about how you're communicating with your sources, you know, what to do with your phone, what to do with your computer. So it's really become an active part of our workflow. It's not enough to just talk about the story you're setting out to cover and how you're going to report the news. It's how you're going to do so safely. And I think, again, having an approach that is not one size fits all, because you know, if you arm a journalist who's going out to cover a protest in Chicago with the same gear as a journalist who's going out to cover the border in Lebanon, you know, that's not going to be the right approach. And we've got to be able to make sure that our journalists are safe in the environment in which they are operating. We also get a lot of real-time feedback from our journalists. That's really important to our workflow. You know, what worked, what was helpful, and what wasn't. You know, sometimes we've had journalists that have said, hey, walking around with a this is sometimes in our conflict areas, walking around with a flak jacket that says press all over the front of it is actually not keeping me safe, right? I'd rather be low profile, or I don't want to go and take my big camera out. It's going to be a lot safer in that situation if I'm filming on my iPhone. So really incorporating their real-time feedback. I would say this is not just an everyday discussion for us in the newsroom. This is a multiple times a day discussion, and something that we're always having to iterate on to make sure that we're kind of staying ahead of the curve. And Jody, you know, advises a lot of newsrooms on this with her team as well, of course.
Yeah, so assistance work is a key part of our work. We do a variety of kinds of assistance. Some of it is direct financial assistance to journalists at risk. We focus very much on the emergency piece. So, you know, what needs to happen now to get that person to a place of safety or to ensure that they can continue safely reporting. So we are able to provide small grants, for example, to help people with medical care, to help people cover the cost of needing to go into exile in an emergency. Again, one of the very fast growing areas of our work. We're able to provide small grants for mental health support. Again, unfortunately, a very fast growing area of our work, and we're lucky to be working with the Global Centre for Journalism and Trauma closely with them, who do great work supporting journalists who need mental health support. We've also recognized that it's really important to work together with other organizations. So last year we came together with 4 other organizations to create the Journalist Assistance Network in the US to ensure that journalists were able to draw on the resources of a variety of different organizations. So some will focus very much on digital security, for example, how to keep your devices safe. A really big risk now potentially for journalists coming in and out of the States. We provided our first ever travel advisory for the United States last year, and I know we're beginning already to get a number of queries about the upcoming World Cup, for example. So working with Freedom of the Press Foundation, for example, who are really strong on that. Or legal requests, again, something like the Reporters Committee, which has done great work in the United States, working to support organizations on legal threats, or how to deal with online harassment, which is something that PEN America has done a great deal of work on, or physical safety, which something like IWMF has done great work on. So coming together so that people, especially small newsrooms who are not able to kind of give that sort of holistic support that someone like the AP might be able to provide, we're able to coordinate with others to make sure that we're providing that. So it is a very fast growing area of work. It's really important because even if you have all of the financial sustainability that we're talking about, even if you have notionally protections within your constitution for a free press, that doesn't necessarily guarantee it. So you do need this suite of sort of safety and legal support offerings to make sure that people can continue to work, particularly when the changes are happening at high speed.
I want to be a little bit conscious of time here, so we'll close with this to each of you. For people who are watching this, what actually makes a difference in protecting press freedom right now? What can people do to help?
Well, I'll go ahead. I mean, there's so much. I'll maybe mention just two. I think the one is, doing what you're doing and encouraging others to do the same. Stay informed about what's happening in this space. I know there is so much happening out there, but I think Jody said this at the beginning, what is happening certainly in the United States is something we have seen happen in other parts of the world, and it is part of an attack on democracy. And I say that not as a political statement, but just as the leader of a fact-based news organization. This is part of what happens when there are attacks on a system of democracy. And so staying informed about this in particular, I think is so relevant. And then I'm sure others will agree with this, but it is, in addition to that, actively supporting a news organization, a local news organization, whatever your news organization of choice is. There are so many ways to get your information. Choose an organization that is fact-based. Choose an organization that is doing this kind of credible work, because they need your support.
Well, I would say the same. Serve yourself as a citizen of this country, and serve your community by supporting your local and strong fact-based journalistic enterprise. And that can come in different colors. You can choose. There are plenty of people, plenty of options, but choose one that you know is fact-based and has professional journalists working there, and people who live by professional journalistic standards. That is the thing that is really the foundation of American journalism.
So I say that you can do three things, and there are three things that you can do today. So you spend money. If you support an independent media outlet, great. Now go and find another one. Price of a coffee once a month, support another one. And you can also obviously support our organizations, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, like AP, we're a nonprofit, and all of the funding that we get goes to support journalists. So spend money. It doesn't have to be a lot, but every amount counts. Speak out. It's really important in this moment that we all vocal about how important a free press is. Burying your head in the sand does not make the autocrats go away. It just emboldens them. So if you believe in a free press, we need to see that very much in the defense of an independent media, and the condemnation of actions that restrict a free press. And then I would say stand up. So not just speaking out, but also refusing to be bullied. And that's a real challenge in this current environment, but there is a whole group of people who will stand in solidarity with you. So being able to stand up in defense of your colleagues in this moment is really, really key.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Julie, Terry, and Jody for being here today. Thank you to everyone who attended with us today. Your time and support just means so much for this work. And if today's discussion reminded you why independent journalism matters, please consider making a gift at apnews.com/donate or by scanning the QR code on your screen. And we'll see you tomorrow for day 2 of AP's Press Freedom Week.